Thursday, everyone. End of the quarter, end of the half.
It's time to start singing Living on a Prayer, right? No, maybe.
Maybe.
We're halfway there. We are halfway, or now over halfway through 2022 somehow. I don't know when that happened, but
I don't think about time anymore.
I feel like Jamie wants to start her time discussion. Every time we talk about time, Jamie's like, yes.
I'm a big time travel person, a big time travel aficionado. So that's why. And I have lots to say on the theories as it relates to time. So.
Wow. All right. That's our next webinar then. Got a topic all nailed down.
Is time linear? Is a big, super nerdy topic.
You watch all the time travel movies? Like, what's your favorite time travel movie?
So from a nostalgia perspective, it's Back to the Future, but I do like some of the other time travel things that are out there. I would say I'm a big fan of the Timeless television series. And I also like About Time, which is another, it's like a rom-com.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there are a lot.
That one's heartbreaking. I feel like with all time travel movies, I like cry so much at the end of them. What do you think about the movie Click?
I'm not a fan of Click. That recently came up recently, and someone said, "Hey, what about that?" I was like, "Yeah, but no."
Yeah,
Sandler movie, right?
Yeah, it's not one of his best, but it made me cry.
Jamie, would you consider? I don't know if you're watching The Umbrella Academy. Would you consider that a time travel show?
Yes, I'm watching it right now. I'm in the middle of the 3rd season. I'm almost done. It is a time travel show for sure.
Yeah, for
Jamie,
sure.
I have a book recommendation for you. I can't remember the title. I'll look it up though after this and send it over to you. It was a really good one. It's basically about a guy who gets to start over his life like 100+ times and tries to do it right every time. It's really interesting.
Is it a science fiction book?
Yeah, I would consider it that. Also, 11/22/63 by
have it. Yes,
it's so good.
Yeah, if we have any attendees as folks are starting to come on that want to follow up and would like our movie and written suggestions for anything related to time travel, happy to provide that in addition to anything about Boomerang and Bite Check.
Great. All right, can everyone see my screen okay? All right. Well, let's get started. It's a few minutes past 2. Love the time travel talk. Wish it could go on forever, but we got to switch gears. We're talking about debunking cybersecurity compliance myths, and we've teamed up with our friends from BiteCheck. We've got Jamie Tomasello here, the COO of BiteCheck, as well as Tara Cook, the Director of Compliance. Jamie and Tara, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah. Jamie, can you do a quick intro? Tell us a little bit about yourself besides your love of time travel.
Absolutely, more than happy to. So I've recently joined BiteCheck as their Chief Operating Officer and have been involved with BiteCheck from the beginning as a board advisor. But before that, I have been in the cybersecurity, trust and compliance, trust and safety, governance, risk and compliance space now for over 22 years. I have worked for organizations from web security companies to internet service providers to nonprofits and law firms. I've worked for Cloudflare, Duo Security, Gusto, Comcast. And at the end of the day, a lot of the work that I try to focus on is how to defend and extend the digital rights of users at risk around the world, and how do we keep our organizations and our users' data safe.
Excellent. Thank you so much for that. We're excited to hear your insight.
Thank you.
Tara, how's it going? Tell me a little bit about what brought you to BiteCheck and kind of what's your background.
Sure. So like I already said, my name is Tara Cook. I'm the Director of Compliance here at BiteCheck. So a little bit of my background is I love governance, risk, and compliance. Like it was my thing when I was in college and everyone gave me side eye when I was like, oh, I love policies and like these different frameworks. I've been in security for 12+ years now. I have my background primarily in network security, but as time has gone on, I've done everything from cybersecurity engineering, information security engineering, GRC audit, QA work, everything except for pen testing and programming. So GRC and audit those really where my passion lies. So yeah, I did technical program management too. I've worked at places such as Gusto, Ernst & Young, a couple other places doing consultant work and a bunch of other things in between. As far as what brought me into BiteCheck, one, Jamie, and then two, I very much believe in the mission of making compliance suck less. When you are an auditor or just working in GRC as a whole, you come across a lot of people who are just like, "Ooh, I really don't want to talk to you. I don't want you to be here, and I don't want anything to do with GRC." So with our mission to try and make it suck less, it really hits home and showing people that it does not have to be hard. It does not have to be painful. It can be actually enjoyable, and you can make it work to your benefit, depending on what you're trying to accomplish.
Excellent. Yeah, we're excited to have you on board. And, your mission of making compliance suck less, making it easier, that's something that aligns with our mission at Blue Mira, which takes us over to Matthew Warner. He is a veteran here of webinars. He is the CTO and co-founder. You've probably seen him before if you've watched any of our webinars. Matt, we're so excited that you're able to join us today.
Excited to be here. And one day I'm going to update that picture, but it won't be today. Yeah, I'm excited to be here and talk about compliance with the exciting BiteCheck team.
Yes, and full disclosure, we are a BiteCheck customer, they helped us to complete our SOC 2 compliance, so we can talk about some background there.
For sure. Yes. Gotta love SOC 2.
Yeah.
Literally, you have to love it. It's a
And my name is Erica Mixon. I'm content manager here at Blue Mira. I'll just be your host and MC throughout this next hour or so. Just a couple of housekeeping things. We will be doing Q&A. It's possible that, if you put in a question, we might be able to answer that naturally in the course of the slides that we have set up and the conversations that we are going to talk about. But if it's a question that, we haven't thought about yet, we'll potentially save that towards the end. We'll keep it casual. Either way, feel free to send in your questions either through the chat box or the Q&A box. Either one is totally fine, and we will make sure that your questions get answered in a timely fashion. And we're excited to delve into the topic. Jamie, this is kind of something that you have really brought to light as we were trying to come up with some topics, some potential webinar topics for the both of us. Why is this topic so near and dear to your heart personally? I'm curious.
Oh, well, I think one of the biggest challenges is that people don't like compliance. They hear the word compliance, it gives like a guttural reaction where folks are like, oh God, no, or it feels like red tape, or it feels like something that is just unnecessary and people don't see how it relates to the work that they do every day. And one of the things that I think is really important is that we dispel some of those myths and understand, why compliance exists, but more importantly, how can you have a positive experience? And I think one of the things that we hear about as a myth about the lift is too much for the engineering team to pursue any certain kind of compliance framework, whether it's pursuing SOC 2, whether it's PCI compliance. And I know that we've just gone ahead and put up a poll to get a good sense right now of what your organization size is, and this will help us kind of talk a little bit more about what some of the how the myths would apply to you based on your organizational size. So please feel free to answer that poll while that's up. And we'll talk a little bit more through that after everybody votes. But while folks are voting, talking about this first myth that the lift is too much for our engineering team, because compliance does leave that bad taste in someone's mouth, depending on how their compliance experience has been in the past, or the myths or the rumors that they've heard. A lot of times they think, oh my gosh, this is going to be a lot for our engineering team, whether it is because they need to implement a whole bunch of security controls that they feel, is a check the box control, or that, it's something that the engineering team has to figure out every single piece, change everything that they've been doing. And I think the thing that's really important to think about, it doesn't matter if you have a 2-person engineering team or you have a 100-person engineering team, really being focused on what is the problem that you're trying to solve, and how, what is the business reason that we're pursuing this compliance framework. And many times the security controls that you need to implement, especially if you're starting from ground zero, when you don't have anything, is really looking at what operational improvements can we make to ensure that our team is and ultimately our systems and our data are secure, really coming from that perspective versus coming from the perspective of I need to check this compliance box. Tara, did you have further thoughts on this, or Matt?
Matt, I'm curious to hear.
huge...
I'm sorry, Tara, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, Matt, I'm curious to kind of hear your perspective about this being on or leading an engineering team at Blumira and kind of going through that process with BiteCheck. Did you find that it was a big lift? And if so, or if not, like what were some of the ways that you found, methods to lessen that burden?
Blumira was in a kind of unique place when we engaged with BiteCheck because we were PCI compliant already. When we started the company, and to Jamie's point, we started the company, we did it with the thought in mind of how do we keep data secure, what happens as data flows through Blumira. And looking forward, we knew in previous services that we'd worked on, people would like to see that with PCI compliance, and getting SOC 2 was going to be really difficult. And this was 4 years ago now, so you have to keep the lens of time in there as well. Speaking of time travel. So you have to keep that in mind as well. And for us and a lot of what we've experienced, the engineering team is kind of transparent to compliance. They are not involved with compliance. It's not really something that they need to be involved with. And it's not because we're like magical compliance people, but rather the way that we approach building our infrastructure and building governance was from the start, how can we be secure? How can we make sure our customers are secure? How can we make sure our people are secure? And that includes things like turning on MFA, making sure data is properly encrypted, making sure you're handling data properly. And when you're doing that in that way, then the compliance effort is more of a like due diligence. Are you doing this? Is this working the way you expect it to be working? Do you have all the data in place so we can make sure that this is happening? And the engineering team, and I know because I talked to them about this a lot, and I'm the one with a lot of the access, so I get to help with a lot of this stuff as the CTO of the company, where getting information out to prove that you're doing something should be a quick and easy lift for the engineering team. The stuff that's part of compliance should be baked into a lot of your processes already. And if you're in that situation, or we've all probably been or seen in these situations, or you're frantically trying to like solve this problem inside of compliance, it's usually because you just miss something, which is natural and happens as you're growing a company, or you weren't able to execute on a part of security as you were growing, and you're like, oh, we'll deal with that later, which is a natural thing that happens as you're changing and you're growing and as things are being deployed. But compliance is really helpful at pushing those things along, helping them and helping the engineering team, because you don't want to let any team, it doesn't matter, engineers or whatever, just do whatever they want. There should be some amount of process and control within that. And humans are naturally going to just kind of do what they know. So you got to help them through. And so it's one of those situations where it's too much of a lift for an engineering team when you make it their problem. Like if you make it exclusively the engineering team's problem, like, hey, we've never done this before and we didn't tell you should care about this. This is now your thing, go do it. It's going to be too much of a lift, but this kind of goes back to the thing that Blumira talks about a lot, which is like organizational maturity, security maturity. It all has to come together. And if from the top, you aren't pushing down and saying like, we care that MFA is enabled. We care that data is secure. We care about our customers in that regard. Then you run into that situation where you're frantically doing it from the bottom up and you're like, oh God, none of this is right. How are we going to fix this? And that's when you get into that situation where it feels like too much of a lift, but often it's the fault of the CTO or someone that should have come in and said, this is not how we need to go about that situation.
And I would add on to that one piece, Matt, when you're saying this is coming from the CTO, I think folks understanding where that compliance request comes from, right? If it's just, well, we need to get this, we need to have this compliance framework in order to get this deal, versus framing it of we're pursuing this compliance framework, we're implementing these security controls because it makes our software better, it makes our systems more secure, it protects our customers. I think the language makes a huge difference on how you push that down throughout your organization. And of course, like you said, if you just throw it to your engineering team and say, figure out what SOC 2 is, good luck. I think that's a lot different than really sort of giving them the information, explaining the what and the why, and let them focus on the how.
That's great advice, Jamie. Tara, I didn't mean to cut you off earlier. Was there anything else that you wanted to mention here?
No, I think I'll just reiterate the point as far as how important storytelling is in security as a whole, especially security and compliance when you're mingling the two. If you're not able to tell a great story as to, again, why we're doing the things that we're doing, it's going to make it a lot harder to get people on board with what you're trying to do. And sometimes the story is just as simple and easy as, hey, there's, an RFP that we're trying to go towards, and SOC 2 or whatever compliance framework is going to help us get that. Okay, cool, great. At least people are understanding instead of just being like, hey, need to go do this thing. Okay, bye. Like, we don't like that when that happens pretty much any time in your life, whether when you were a kid and your parent was like, I need you to do this thing. Why? Just do as I say, not as I do. That's not fun, nor is that motivating, nor is that going to make me want to do it any faster or slower or at all. So keeping in mind just like your storytelling when you're talking to your engineering team and throughout the rest of the business, considering compliance impacts the entire business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really great point. It's just bringing that element of psychology in there as well. So we did launch the poll asking what size is your organization. It looks like we have, two ends of the spectrum here. 37% are 1 to 50 employees, and then 63% are 200 plus employees. Are there any considerations that people need to make when they're in a smaller versus a larger organization when it comes to compliance?
I think you're just thinking about, it kind of comes back to that security maturity. I know Matt's going to talk about that a little bit later, but really thinking about when you're a smaller organization and how you assess your risk is going to be different than when you're a larger organization. And if you have multiple business units and more different and disparate types of data and more potential to lose that structure and lose that process because there's so many different moving parts. So I do think it is about that security journey as you grow as an organization and what types of controls that you're putting in place to reduce that overall business risk.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. Great. So should we move on to myth number 2? Meeting compliance won't make a security impact. Now, Matt, I'm curious as to, I'm sure you have some strong opinions about this one.
Yeah, I mean they're strongish, yeah, for sure. I mean it's such a, I mean, I think all of us in the industry have dealt with this on and off for decades now around like, oh, you'll be compliant. It doesn't matter. It's just a thing that we do because we have to. And I think in my experience, when someone tells me that compliance isn't making a security impact, they're probably cheating their audit in like 90% of cases. Maybe they aren't in every case, but in a lot of cases, they are the person that's like, I'm just going to shut off those Windows 2000 machines during the volume scan and hand that to my auditor. And a lot of it has to do with, I mean, you can look at the numbers coming out of M365. They only have like 50-60% MFA enabled broadly across 365. So you think about that situation, like why not? Why shouldn't compliance push on MFA and say, well, you really need to enable MFA? Because there are a lot of organizations out there that will be happy to, not because they're consciously doing it, back security maturity, because that's always what I end up back at. They will be not necessarily aware that's relevant or important to them until they have these conversations around process. How can we mature our company? How can we make sure that people are secure? How can we kind of roll this whole thing through? And it's really important from that top level perspective, of course, like how are we mature? How do we make sure that flows down? How do we make sure our users are secure? How can we make sure we go through it? But then you get really deep into it, depending on those compliance requirements around like, how is data flowing? Is it encrypted? Can you validate that? Are you sure that it is? Where's that data living? And a lot of that feels like just time burnt when you're going through the audit. But realistically, it's super important because, and Tara has mentioned this, I know I've talked to ByteCheck about this a lot. It's really important for compliance to be supporting you and growing your like governance and your security and how you're kind of applying IT processes across your environment. And if you're treating it that way and the auditor isn't the person you're fighting, which I think pen testers are part of the reason why everyone thinks this way, because pen testers are like your enemy, but the auditor really shouldn't be your enemy in a lot of situations. They should be supporting you through it. And if you're working with your auditor to help you through it, you aren't hiding that Windows 2000 machine. You're talking about compensating controls. How do we get off this? How do we make sure that this works for us? Because we know we have this really old thing. So how do we really make this work? Or how do we get off it? And if you aren't doing that, which would have created there would have been a security impact if you were doing that, you run into the situation where you get people that look at PCI, especially version 3 and below PCI. Version 4 is a little better, and say like, well, this doesn't matter. Like, what is this? Is just done. Like manual review of my logs. No one's going to do this. We'll just lie about this, which is what everyone's done for the last 20 years of PCI for the most part. And it's something that I think the evolution of standards over the last 10 years has been pretty impactful. I think PCI is the right direction. I think SOC 2 is doing a good job on the governance side. I think NIST, while being very robust on the 800 side, is very good in regard to their processes. And I think people are moving that direction, but it honestly, I'm just going to keep taking it back here. I'm going to try not to. It goes back to that, like it'll create a security impact if your organization is willing to take in this process and apply it to your organization. If it's not, and you won't, that won't make a security impact because you're going to basically cheat the process, probably, no offense. And you're kind of spike it so you can get through it and move on to the next year, which you can do. And there are a whole lot of companies out there that'll do it with you, but it's not going to help you get better. It's not going to make your product better. And it's going to suck when you get fined for finally getting breached because you weren't paying attention in that situation, which does happen.
Tara, what are your thoughts on this matter? I see you kind of nodding over there.
It's hard to follow up after that mic drop that just happened. A lot of the things that I think about when it comes down to it, which is like for SOC 2, for instance, or really any report that you might go through and have, is when you get findings, which findings are like super taboo and touchy and will literally cause people to start to lose their mind. I want to make it very publicly known, findings are not the end of the world. Findings are there to help you. But I think people look at it in such a way where it's like, oh no, I've done something wrong and I'm being slapped on the wrist. That slap on the wrist, if you want to if you want to consider it that, it's actually there to help you. It is there to make that security impact. That finding is letting you know, hey, we noticed something that is not operating effectively. We noticed something that is not designed effectively. You should want to know when your things are not designed or operating effectively so you can then go through and remediate that or put in compensating controls, put in mitigating controls, accept that risk, do whatever in the grand scheme of things. If you are essentially fighting against getting findings, you are in turn like limiting that impact to security, in my opinion, in a negative way, because it's just like, well, I don't want this finding. I don't want an adverse opinion. I don't want, a qualified opinion. Those things are there to help you. And I know it doesn't sound like it. And I know it's also scary because you can take, like when you take that and you go back to your management or you take that report and you share it with your third parties, whomever the party may be, and they look at it and yeah, it can cause some very uncomfortable conversations of, well, why isn't this in place? Why didn't you do this? Why didn't you do that? And that's when you take it and spin it, which is why I keep telling people compliance is all about how you want to use it to your advantage. You can very much come back if you have other supporting data. I won't say the SOC 2 is going to be your end all be all. But you can say, hey, we don't have the money, we don't have the resources, we don't have this, we don't have that. Remember that budget reallocation that happened 6 months ago from us to them and blah. Like you can take these different findings and go back to your management and let them know we can potentially do more, but I might need more staffing, or I just need more support from you all in the grand scheme of things and whatever that looks like. So that to me is how compliance can have a security impact, especially if you are in some of these super heavily regulated areas. Granted, I have feelings about HIPAA compliance and I have feelings about GDPR compliance. But when you're in, oh yeah, great. Here's my fun time. So in working in the compliance space, I have heard this often, more often than I ever want to hear it in my entire existence, is, hey, I want to be HIPAA compliant. Hey, I want to be GDPR compliant. That's not a thing. I'm going to just throw that out there. And the reason why I say that that is not a thing is because we, the parties that do attestations, cannot attest to HIPAA. We cannot attest to GDPR. There are no like structures or frameworks in that way where we can give you a certification, if you will, to say that you're HIPAA or GDPR compliant. This is where I would normally be spicy and say if you got one from some other party, that's cool. And I will leave it at that's cool. But there is no such thing as being compliant to either of those things. I like to say it as you can be aligned to those different frameworks or those regulatory bodies. And when I say aligning, meaning You can do comparisons to SOC 2 to HIPAA, SOC 2 to GDPR, or whatever your common control framework is, to be like, okay, does this in fact make sense for my environment? Am I meeting the spirit of what's being asked by HIPAA? Am I meeting the spirit of what's being asked by GDPR? It's also worth noting HIPAA and GDPR are very murky orders. HIPAA is, I don't even know how many years old at this point, and we are talking about when technology is not what it was today, and there's approximately, I have no idea how many SaaS products that are out there processing, storing, transmitting, all the things with PHI and HIPAA was not made for that. GDPR, it's GDPR and it's GDPR. Privacy is important. And actually I say that, but thinking about, some of the different privacy things that have happened in the news over the past course of years, California putting together their Privacy Act, things of that nature. All of that was to say there's no such thing as HIPAA or GDPR compliance. You can be aligned to them. You cannot be compliant to them for all intents and purposes. Complying with an attestation and a fancy report that you get. I guess my TLDR is compliance can help you make a security impact if you are willing to take the information that the auditor is giving you and ingest it and realize those findings are there to help you improve your design or your operating efficiencies to move you to that next level of maturity.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Just approaching it as a way to become more secure and, using that framework as a way to level up your security maturity. That seems like a really good approach, especially for those organizations that don't have a security program to start, or ones that have, lower security maturity. Seems like a good way to get to, have some sort of framework to get started. All right, let's talk about myth number 3. I need to log everything to stay compliant. What do we think about that? Is that, Matt, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this because, as someone that has, created and developed and maintains this SIM product, what are you seeing when people ask to, turn on all the log sources and ingest all of that data for Blumira? Is that something that you recommend?
It's such a hard question to answer. So this is super interesting. I wonder who we have on the call because it varies so much. Like if you are state and local government and you have to follow LEO, law enforcement guidelines of the FBI, your data collection guidelines, which you may or may not be meeting, are wildly different than your guidelines if you are trying to meet HIPAA guidelines, or you're trying to meet SOC 2, or well, to an extent, but PCI more specifically, guidelines associated with higher logging. And really what I think we end up seeing here at Blumira is that no one has any idea, not necessarily on what they need to log, but really more how long those logs should even be retained, and where should they be stored, and how do they need to be accessed, and really what do I need to be doing associated with that data. So it's not really necessarily you need to log everything, but it's really more that kind of going back to the compliance requirements that you're looking at. The compliance requirements are going to tell you in most cases the kind of things that they're expecting you to be able to review or have or store. PCI is very prescriptive as what they think that you should store and be able to review, and NIST is as well in different ways, and so are FBI guidelines in regard to LEO access. So it really is a situation where most SIMs that people are using, and HIPAA is a perfect example for this. If you asked anyone about HIPAA data retention, you will get 12 different answers, because as far as I know, it depends on state, it depends on where you're collecting it depends on how it's working. And in most cases, most doctors' offices aren't like, I'm going to keep 7 years of traffic logs. This is going to be a great time for me. It's just not something that's really possible. So a lot of what I see tends to be people not necessarily, well, in both cases, not necessarily even understanding what they need to log, but really more, how can I log enough to be secure? Because compliance in regard to visibility from a compliance perspective is not the same as visibility into security. That's not to say the two aren't aligned, but for example, I know our security team would be remiss if I didn't bring this up. Like authentication logs are super useful and you need them. From an audit perspective, you really must keep authentication logs for a good period of time, a year or more, generally speaking, depending on the compliance framework. However, you're not going to detect a threat with authentication logs outright, most likely. You might, if you have really good EVA and they happen to attack a user specifically, but you're not going to detect a dropper that lands on a box in that situation. Just not how it works. So it's one of those areas where I'm a big fan of logging everything, so I'm pretty biased here. And Blumira is biased because we don't charge on ingest, so there's some inherent bias that's going on here. I think from my perspective, the myth for me and what I talk to people tends to be around, well, I need to store data longer. Well, I need to store data for 7 years. Do you really need to store 7 years of SIM data? How are you approaching this? What is your approach to it? Where do you want to store it? Can it go somewhere else? Can it go into cold storage? How are you approaching it? Because generally speaking, a lot of organizations that we talk to should have more logging, but have pulled back on that logging because of cost or because it didn't make sense. And they probably had a compensating control from their auditor that was like, we cannot store 7 years of authentication logs. It is not something that we can do just from cost and effort perspective. And for me and for Blumira, a lot of it is kind of retraining people into, this can be possible, but is this important for you? How can we tweak your log output that's useful for you from a security perspective, as well as useful for us as the person storing that data for you? Because you don't necessarily want everything. Like, do I want your VMware debug logs? No, I don't want your VMware debug cluster logs. I do not want those. They're not going to be useful for your time or our time or anyone's time. But what could be useful is someone using terminal, going into one of those hosts on VMware from an audit perspective, a compliance perspective, as well as a security perspective. So it becomes this really kind of interesting focus around making sure you're getting the right data in, making sure that data is coming in a way that's properly available, parsed, and structured. And then not necessarily looking at compliance for your entire guidelines as to data coming in, but using compliance as your, this must happen. This is the visibility we need. This is the kind of reporting we need out of that visibility. And here's where we can grow in our security maturity as well. But again, I'm biased in a slightly different way here.
To the one piece that I feel really strongly about that Matt said was the reports that come out of it. I've worked with other organizations where they just view compliance as, I log everything, right? And that's it. And that's where it stops. And I think what's really important is to think about, well, what problem are you really trying to solve by logging everything? What is the spirit of the control or the requirement? Why are you logging anything in order to do what? And I think that's what people need to keep in mind of when you're making these decisions of what to log. You can log everything to stay compliant, but does that actually mean that you're secure? Are you doing anything at what's the output, and then what outcome are you trying to achieve through your logging and your event and your monitoring? Like, that's really important to think about it all together. So it's interesting. I'm with Matt on I'd love love for people to log everything, but not just to stay compliant. Like, there has to be a purpose for what you're logging, and what are you going to do after it's logged?
For sure. To me, that hits home with.
Yeah, those are really good points. And I also just put in the chat an article on how you can prioritize log sources. So if you're getting started with a SIM, for example, how do you know where to start when it comes to which log sources are most important from a general perspective? Definitely differs on your environment, but it's a good way to get started with that resource that I just put in the comments there. Any other additional thoughts that we wanted to talk about here? Or should we move on to the next myth?
I will only add that your logs are as good as whatever you do with them afterwards. Otherwise, they are a digital paperweight that is costing you money.
I'm sorry, Terry, you cut out for a moment there. What are digital paperweights?
Your logs, if you're just logging everything, but not actually doing that follow-up with your logs, like, they are essentially just costing you money to hang out in the ether somewhere.
Right. If you're not using Blumira, where we don't charge based on log ingestion, but yes, absolutely. So let's talk about myth number 4. There's no point to being proactive with compliance. So I know talking with the BiteCheck team that there have actually been a good amount of their customers that are proactive with compliance. I'm curious to hear, what the difference is working with those customers. Jamie, do you want to talk about that for a bit?
Sure. So, there's some folks that are proactive as it relates to security compliance, like Blumira, that said, like, from the ground up, we're going to build security in from the start. And it isn't just because they're being proactive with compliance, they're being proactive with security. They're making that part of their product and cultural DNA. So, there is a point to it from that perspective, but there's also a business point to being proactive with compliance. I think these are situations where you want to get ahead of from your customer requests as you move up market and you're trying to get larger customers, ones that have more robust compliance programs themselves or vendor security assessment programs. They're going to ask you for some sort of validation, some sort of third-party proof that you practice what you preach, that you do what you say that you do. And that's where some of these compliance standards come in handy, as well as compliance certification or attestations. And so if you are trying to pursue certain sectors in the market or move up market, having something like a SOC 2 in advance is going to show to that customer that you're worthy of that trust, that you are thinking about those things, and that you are mature enough to handle their data and their business responsibly. Additionally, as an earlier stage startup, it is something that by pursuing SOC 2 compliance or other compliance frameworks, it's going to make the due diligence process much easier as you're pursuing additional rounds of funding. And folks who are funding you and investors want to see that you are taking things like security seriously, how you think about data, how you think about privacy, thinking about what those risks are to their investments. And if you're taking that seriously and being proactive with compliance, it does speed up that funding process.
And then there's also the external validation of security maturity. Matt, I'm curious to hear your perspective on that. I know that you have a lot of passionate thoughts about security maturity. Let's hear it.
Yeah, I mean, this goes back to a lot of the conversations and talks that I've done recently, just around if you want your company to be secure, if you want to avoid breaches, if you want to maintain employees, if you want your customers to be happy, if you want all those positive things to happen, the best way to do it is to have a positive and process-driven organization. It's just the way to do it. If you are looking at an organization that is having trouble with keeping people, and they're having trouble with moving forward, it usually has to do with the fact that there are dogs barking in the background. That's going to get annoying. It usually has to do with the fact that there's some amount of need for maturity at the top of the organization to be pushed down across the team. Compliance and being proactive about compliance and how that fits within the security maturity of an organization is a top-down function for an organization. And it doesn't mean that there isn't like bottom-up requirements for the organization, but it becomes really important because it's the only way for that organization, the customers of that company, to understand the direction and the maturity of it as well. And that's where the audits come into place. That's where the attestations come into place to show we know what we're doing. We're trying to move forward. We're improving year over year. This is how we're approaching it. And not only does your internal organization know that, because it's something that you should be moving forward in that regard, training them, showing them why it's good and better to be doing that, educating your salespeople why you should be telling people that your SOC 2 is a SaaS company, if you're a SaaS company, for example. And just as much as it's important for the wide world to see, hey, we are a growing and maturing organization and we want to keep doing better. No one's a perfect security company, and compliance doesn't make anyone perfect, but it makes you start to move in the right direction and helps you grow that organization. And I have no doubt as Boomera, a year from now, when we do another SOC 2 or PCI, we'll come with something like, we could probably do better here. This is where we could change this and improve this. And let's make sure we get this through to the team. And every organization has an area they can do better in, but the goal shouldn't be solving it all that first year, which is what I think it often feels like, is like, well, we got to fix this all now. And people also feel it with pen tests, and Tara brought this up of like the findings. Like you also feel that with those critical pen test findings of like, how could you dare to have this enabled on this machine? And the pen testers find that we'll use MS SQL command is one that's often a pen test. So like, how could you dare to have this on your SQL server? It's like, well, we use this for a bunch of stuff and we've been using it for 20 years. What do you want from us? And it's how do you build that whole thing together? How do you make sure the company understands what's happening? Because it's not you fighting against someone. It shouldn't be. It should be kind of that general understanding of direction. Everyone knows where you're going. And if everyone knows in the organization, then they can also help kind of spread that to other people outside the organization. It usually all kind of comes together with, we understand where we're going. There's a single path forward. We are all going to go down this path together. Because the moment that fractures and you get into the siloing, it's really hard to bring it all back together in the grand scheme of it all. So it helps you be proactive because it helps you kind of grow together in that maturity.
Yeah, those are all great insights, Matt. Thank you for sharing that. Kind of brings us to our next myth, which is a nice segue there. If we're compliant, we're secure. What do you think about that? Is that something that is an accurate statement or not?
For me?
Yeah, sure, Matt. Go ahead.
Okay. I talk too much. It's a problem, I'm fairly sure. Yeah, I mean, being compliant is only as good as your auditor. It's only as good as the people on your side that were doing the audit that gave that evidence, because it's real easy to not give real evidence to auditors. Not that you shouldn't do that. I mean, not that you should do that. Sorry, the other word. You should not do that. But people do it. I mean, it's just a natural human of like, there's a lot of work here. I don't think I can do this. I think I know what I can do. I can give them this. And it's just kind of that natural kind of loop that does happen. That goes back to security maturity. Where are the checkpoints? How do you help grow that team so they know like it's okay that things are wrong? We will grow through it. And so it's one of those areas where, can you be compliant and secure? Sure. Yeah, I think that compliance helps grow that maturity and process to get you to that point. But for one, saying that we're secure is a crazy thing that no one should ever say. And if you do say it, you should knock on wood like immediately and just pound on it, because it's a dangerous thing to say, like we're secure 100%. But compliance does help you build that structure into the organization where you have logging, you have some amount of detection, you have MFA most likely, you have some structure around defense in depth that's been built into you through that kind of compliance structure. And you've at least been validated of like, I now have a bunch of old stuff, but I'm working on it, and here's what my controls are to deal with that old stuff. Or, oh no, I'm just going to get rid of this, and I know that I can now. So I think it can lead you to becoming more secure, especially, but it really depends on who you are, who your company is, and who that auditor is. Because I think we've all dealt with the auditor that's just kind of like, whatever, just get it done. It's fine. We paid and we'll go forward. And those are the auditors you don't want. You want the auditors who are going to be partners with your organization and help you grow those processes.
Tara, what are some factors that kind of lead an organization to not be secure, even though they may be compliant?
Sure. When people are just looking at compliance as a way to check the box, it is very easy to, I'll say, look at NIST or SOC or whatever and be like, they are telling me to do X, Y, Z, A, B, C, and I will do that one thing. And like, that is that. But that is not reflective of your business. That is not reflective of potentially the tech that you have, the resources that you have, what have you. So if you are just looking at compliance in that way and thinking that it'll magically make you secure, that's just not the case. If you are going through and actually looking at building good security controls, that will lead you towards having good compliance controls. Always keep in mind, we in the compliance space talk about the letter of the law versus the spirit of the law. And a lot of compliance is philosophy and like looking at whatever it is that NIST or the AICPA or whoever wrote whoever wrote high trust, I have no idea. Whoever wrote this stuff, and it's just like, what are they trying to get at? Like, what problem are we trying to solve for, as Jamie always tells me? It's the same sort of thing when you're going through and looking at compliance. So if you're building these security controls and having the concept of security by design, that will lend you towards compliance by design. Having a solid compliance program will strengthen and enrich your security controls and your program. But just going through and saying like, yep, I'm going to just do these things because that's what AICPA told me to do and nothing more and nothing less, you're probably going to honestly leave yourself with more holes than not. And that's when you are starting to look at the different findings in your reports, because whenever you're building compliance, you need to keep the two lenses in mind of, is this designed effectively? And this is actually going to do the thing that I want it to do. A while back, I had wrote an article specifically around SOC 2 type 1, type 2 engagements when it comes down to like when you cook. your type 1 is going to be that recipe. Your type 2 is going to be the actual output after you cook the thing. So just going back to compliance and security, I guess I will try and, I'm like Matt, I talk a lot.
I love it.
Try and wrap that together. Focus on building a good, solid security program. And when you're thinking about your compliance controls, how do those two blend well together? And if you have to make some potential edits, okay, cool. Also, just keep in mind, whatever you say that you're doing in compliance, somebody's going to come back in and check it. And more times than not, we're going to be checking these different security controls. And then we have questions of, hey, why isn't this thing doing what you said that you're supposed to be doing? So let's not focus on aspirational. Let's focus on what is real, what is happening. And if you're not mature enough yet for whatever reason, that's okay. Like any auditor worth their weight in salt will tell you, that's okay. We'll give you credit for what you do have and what you can't do or have, and then we'll focus on other stuff later. We'll talk to you through remediations and potential things that you could do to help your environment, but focus on what you do actually have.
Mm-hmm. And that seems like an approach that we take with security, right, Matt, is with smaller teams, being overwhelmed with the prospect of becoming secure or just building that security program. Something is better than nothing, right?
Yeah, and I know Tara and Jamie said this at the beginning, but from ByteCheck's perspective, but I mean, really all of this, and that's the most broad thing I've ever said. All of this is really just treating people like people and acting like, hey, that's all like going to work together to solve these problems and do it in a way that we know we can be successful as a team. And that's really kind of just like baseline. Like, let's try to move forward in that direction. See, it's something that with smaller organizations and bigger organizations, and I've expressed this before, I'm sure some people disagree with me, there's not that much difference between a small organization and a big organization when it comes to thing I have to secure, how I secure the thing, unless the technology stacks are wildly different. What's different is the scale, of course, that comes into it, but the problems are not wildly different. You still have the same authentication problems, you still have the same networking problems, you still have the same visibility problems, ignoring the scale thing, which Boomer tries to solve, but blah, 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 selling, yada, yada. So it's one of those areas where it becomes something of a continuous motion forward to continue to improve your processes and grow together, and use that auditor, use that pen tester, use guidance coming from your defensive security applications and teams to say like, hey, here's how we can move forward, here's how we can get better, this is the direction we can move in, and take those iterative steps to do that. Because then you get better on a day-by-day basis, quarter-by-quarter, year-by-year basis, and not a, well, crap, we weren't able to do it this year, so let's just make it up or lie, and then we'll try again to do that again the next year. And it's a terrible cycle to get stuck in, and companies get stuck in it, where you're just like, well, I guess we'll just switch to another auditor, and maybe it'll be better. And you see the same things in tech stack, so it's like, well, we'll switch firewalls this year. The licenses, we'll switch to PAN, it'll be fine. And it's a really hard way to go about process building and company building, and anything you can do to kind of make everyone feel sane and grow a process is always going to help move things forward.
Yeah. To both Matt and to Tara's points regarding building security programs and selecting a technical auditor, I think that's a really key thing that a lot of folks go into that may not be familiar with SOC 2, may not be familiar with PCI, and just Google like PCI auditors, SOC 2 auditors. And I think, what's really important is when you have those initial discussions with your SOC 2 auditors or your assessment firms or whoever's going to provide you with advisory services, really be focused on, have they worked with companies of your size? Have they, what is their experience, not just as an organization, but down to the individual auditors? What's their technical experience with your specific tech stack and the types of controls that you would at your size and scale? And having them be able to understand when you're building that security program, what are those compensating, mitigating, or alternative controls? And can they give you really actionable recommendations at the end of the audit, whether you have an unqualified opinion with 0 exceptions, or whether you end up with an adverse opinion? Being able to have really strong recommendations coming out of there to that scale with the size of your security program is absolutely key for your success.
Yeah, that's great, Jamie. And that kind of brings us to, what does ByteCheck bring to the table that makes you different from other compliance companies, and how do you approach the compliance process in a way where customers aren't just checking that box?
So, one of the things to think about for BiteCheck is that, ultimately we are a solution that can help you establish your security program, automate your readiness assessments, and essentially complete your SOC 2 audit faster, all from one single platform. We're very focused as one of our core values of it's people first. We do that both internally and externally within our own product, recognizing that when we think about people, process, and technology, a lot of other platforms or a lot of other compliance thinking is really around that technology and some of the process, but not really thinking about how do we get compliance across to people and how do we empower them with information? How do we make it easier? How do we make it suck less and really focus on those pain points? And that's what BiteCheck is able to do through our platform with our automated readiness, through our readiness questionnaire, through our ability to assign control owners, and then utilizing the automated audit testing within the BiteCheck engine that does the things like continuous monitoring, and it collects that evidence in advance. I'll let Tara talk a little bit about our GRC engineers and our technical philosophy as she leads our compliance department.
Yeah, so I know Jamie was like our technical things, but we really do focus on the people first. Like that is what we want to make sure that we hit home, is that you do not have to be like some wizard or technical expert or security expert, GRC expert, what have you, in order to go through the SOC 2 process. What's nice about our platform is we do have some automation built in as far as being able to integrate in some cloud environments. So you get some automated controls that you don't even have to think about once you build in the integrations. We have a flag that lets you know if it's passing or failing, and you go from there. We make sure that our engineers have certificates and knowledge in these cloud platforms as well, so we can actually talk you through the process. If something is failing, we can say, hey, it's failing because of X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Let's figure it out. Or in some cases that if a control is failing, specifically one of the automation ones, we say, okay, why? And maybe it's because you have to have certain ports unrestricted going out to the internet because that's just how your business works. Okay, cool, great, not a problem. Make sure you document that for us. We recognize that is a business risk that your company is willing to accept. Let's keep going. So we want to be technical, but also make sure that we are able to explain these things as simple as possible, because there should not be any weird language barriers or gatekeepery things when it comes down to tech security and compliance, which is why I always tell everyone, try and relate it back to something that is happening in your regular life. We all deal with risk management every day. We just don't call it risk management in our daily life. It's I'm going to go get in my car and go to Burger King and I have car insurance. We don't think about it as like I'm transferred my risk to my car insurance company in case I get hit by something, whatever. So that's one of our big philosophies on the team. And I will always go back to just people integrations, making sure you understand the process. We're available to answer questions and really just, it sounds very cheesy to go back and say, make compliance suck less, but no, seriously, we really want to make compliance suck less and get you through this process where we're not just focusing on the fact that you can trust us or you're getting the SOC 2 report in hopes of whomever you're sharing it with to trust you, but it's actually truthful to your environment. And we get you to those places where you want to be truthfully.
That's great. And if you want to get in touch with BiteCheck, feel free to just hit BiteCheck on that poll that is currently being launched. And so many of those philosophies that you're talking about with BiteCheck also apply to Blumira, which is, why we're so well aligned and such great partners for this webinar. Blumira makes SIM easier for people that aren't necessarily security experts. So we do all of the parsing, all of the configuration, all on our end. Our security engineers are writing detection rules, deploying that automatically in your platform. So you don't have to deal with it, essentially. So you can focus on things that matter most, and that deployment is very easy compared to traditional SIMs. We take typically, an hour or less for most deployments, whereas a lot of other SIMs take months or even years if you factor in the endless configuration and fine tuning that you usually have to do for most SIMs. We also just came out with a free edition, so you can try us for free with no strings attached. You don't have to enter a credit card, talk to a salesperson. You can just get your logs up and running. If you have a Microsoft 365 account, it's really easy to get that connected. Matt, I'd like to hear your perspective on this, having created or having co-founded Blumira, a few years ago. What were some of the issues that you were seeing that kind of prompted you to want to fix them?
We went over probably all of them already today in the grand scheme of it all. Blumira came from working with services companies, building out services to help support their defense security and therefore compliance needs. And I think exactly what ByteCheck is working with and what Blumira is doing as well is that in the SMB and mid-market, to an extent in enterprise, you really don't have a lot of good options for, we'll say, a positive feeling as you work through the solution that you're trying to solve, whatever the problem happens to be. Some of the reasons that we like ByteCheck so much is why we use ByteCheck. They're great to work with. And for Blumira, it's just as important that when we sit down with a customer of any size, we can support them in a way that is positive, they understand, it's going to help move them forward, because it's really the only way to do it. And a lot of what's out there on the market is really more of your classic like churn and burn security of like, it's a thing, you can pay a lot of money for it and it'll probably be fine if you have enough people to make it work, or you can pay even more money and we'll throw some people at it and you're not going to know who those people are, but don't worry about it. And we wanted that to be different. And in general, I believe that the security industry as a whole is starting to shift toward this kind of more human-centric, which is needed in the market as well, just as much for the people working in security and IT and compliance. So for Blumira, it's very much this big push of like, how can we keep treating each other more like humans, taking that data in and building processes that make everything work for all of us. And ByteCheck is also great at doing.
Absolutely. Thanks for sharing that, Matt. So if you want to get in touch with us, again, feel free to vote on that poll. You can also check out blumira.com/free and get your free account started right away. It's extremely easy to get those logs up and running and see security value very quickly. So give that a try. All right. Well, thank you all for joining this webinar. Hopefully you learned something new. We have our next webinar coming up July 14th. What's next for cyber insurance? We'll be talking about the cyber insurance industry, what you can expect for the next couple of years there, and how to level up your security program so that you are more easily insurable. So that should be a good one that I'm excited about. And Jamie and Tara, thank you so much for joining us and for taking some time out of your day to talk about compliance. Thank you so much. And Matt, thank you as always for sharing your insight and be willing and available to talk about all things security. We appreciate it.
Thanks, Erica, for being our facilitator.
Of course.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you for joining as well, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. I hope you have a great weekend and a great 4th of July holiday, and
that whole thing.
Yeah, that whole thing. And a great rest of the day. So everyone, take care. Thank you so much for